but we're excited to be able to do this. So if you guys want to stand up and greet those around you, that would be great.
I am holding on to
All right, we're going to sing the stand.
Hi, Mama.
You stood before creation, eternity in your hands. You spoke the earth into motion, my soul now to stand. You stood before my failure, carried the cross for my shame. My sin laid upon your shoulders, my soul now to stand.
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you today. We pray for everybody here that you know that we love you, that we just want to care for you. And just thank you for being our God. Just bless this house now. And have you come here and just be with you. And you will take them and bless them and love them. Your name we pray in your God.
Alright, this next song is, we want you to sing it along with us, but this song we're actually going to try live with no music other than our voices and a guitar. So, if you will stand.
That's a treat for us, and it's a privilege to be there. So thank you for that. Thank you for having pointed us to Jesus this morning. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for what we've experienced. Lord, I thank you that the generation that's coming behind us into your church has a heart for you. They have a heart for worship, and they have a heart to sing to you and to lead us in singing to you. Lord, I thank you for the truths we sang about how great your love is and your grace. Lord, we're going to see that this morning in the sermon. I just thank you for each of these children, Lord, these students, these young people. Lord, I thank you for the families that bring them to church, that support them, and love them. Lord, I thank you for the leadership in their music program. I thank you for what we've seen this morning. Father, I pray now as we open your word, as we see in the life of Jesus, Father, I pray that we would be touched and we would not only learn, but we would worship during this time, Father. It's in Christ's name that we pray this. Amen. Well, this morning, we have been going through a series looking at different people in the Bible. And the next few weeks, we're going to look at Jesus. We're going to focus on Jesus. And this is the first of 4 sermons I'm going to preach on the life of Jesus and how he interacted with people. And if you want to, before I begin, you can turn ahead to Matthew chapter 8. We're going to be in the first 4 verses there. But I want you to think about a question this morning. Who are we when it comes to Jesus? Think about yourself in light of Jesus. Both if you're a believer, who are you before you came to know Jesus? Who are you since you've come to know Jesus? And do you ponder that? Do you think on that? Does that make a difference in who you are? I saw something the other day that reminded me of college. Now, when I think back to college, I think a lot of really good things. I think of going to University of Georgia football games. I know we're all Dogs fans here, except Mr. Carter up there. But I think of going to Georgia games. I think of living in Athens. And there's no prettier city in Georgia than Athens in the fall. It's just a beautiful place to live. But college is not necessarily a good memory for me in a lot of ways because college was probably the most rebellious time in my life. It was a time when I most walked away from following Jesus, the time when I just really decided I wanted to live under my own power and my own path and my own strength and take my own road in living. And I thought a lot about that in light of the sermon this morning and in light of who were we before we came to Jesus. If you don't know Jesus, you might know of his name. Hopefully you know him as more than just a swear word somebody uses. But if you've never had that encounter with Jesus, you can think of the same question, who are you right now? And if you've met Jesus, who are you since you met him? I want to point you this morning to the first 4 verses of the book of Matthew to one person who met Jesus and what happened to him. Now, to give you a little context for this passage, in Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount. What most people would say, and I would agree, is the greatest sermon ever preached. It's a sermon that sort of capsules and comes together with the Christian life. What is the Christian life? Jesus preaches this incredible sermon, and he comes down from the mountain. You heard the verses read earlier. He comes down from the mountain. It's sort of like in our church and in many churches, the pastor goes to the back of the church and everybody files out, and as long as you're not mad at the pastor, you go out the back doors. And you shake, that's okay, you go on. You shake hands and you speak. But Jesus has a pretty different encounter. Jesus has just preached this great sermon, this sermon that is the foundation of his ministry. It's the foundation of the Christian life. And Jesus, like I experience with you all on Sunday morning, Jesus has somebody come up to him after the sermon. But it's very different than what we experience. Let me read it to you again. Matthew 8, beginning verse 1 says this, "Large crowds followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly a man with leprosy approached him and knelt before him. 'Lord,' the man said, 'if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean.' Jesus reached out and touched him. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be healed.' And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus said to him, 'Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed.'" It's very different than a Sunday morning when you might walk by the pastor and say, "Good sermon, preacher." Jesus walks down the mountain, and a man with leprosy comes up. Now let's take a minute to touch on leprosy, because most of us have never had leprosy, never will. In the first world that we live in, leprosy is relatively unknown. In Jesus' day, leprosy was something like, the best thing I could compare it to for our world is something like AIDS. Something that is just an incurable, fatal disease. And it's a disease that came with a stigma. If you had leprosy, here's what happened. If you came down with leprosy and you were diagnosed with leprosy, your family didn't take you to the doctor or to the hospital. You packed your things and you left town, and you went out to caves on the outskirts of the city, and you lived with the other lepers, and you never saw your family again. People might come and drop food off for lepers at a great distance. And when you did have to go somewhere, you would shout out in front of you, "Unclean, unclean, unclean." It was literally a death sentence, both publicly and physically. It was a death sentence because leprosy would eventually kill you. Leprosy would eat away at your body, at your skin. It was a horrific disease. Jesus has preached this incredible sermon, this beautiful sermon that we know so much of, and he walks down the mountain, and out of nowhere, this man whose skin is just covered in sores, and there's a smell about that disease, and parts of his body have rotted away. It's a gruesome picture. And he comes up to Jesus. And Jesus, who has preached these great words, is confronted with now putting those words into action. And this man comes, and you can imagine, the scripture tells us this crowd was around Jesus. And that they all came down the mountain, and you can just imagine as this leper comes up and they see him, the crowd just starts to move away. The crowd starts to spread out. Even the disciples say, "Okay, Jesus, you got this one. That's on you." And this man comes, and he's a pitiful picture. He just falls to his knees and he says, "Jesus, I know if you will, you can make me clean. You can make me whole. You can heal me. You can forgive me. I have no other hope than you." Listen, there was no cure for leprosy. There was no yearly marathon walk to raise money for the leprosy fund. If you got leprosy, you went out of town and you just died slowly over a matter of years. This man has no other hope than to come to the Lord. He bows on his knees and he says, "Oh, Jesus, you're my only hope." And Jesus does two things. Don't miss that he does two things there. Jesus gives him what he asked for. Jesus gives him healing. Jesus takes away his leprosy. There's no record in Jewish history of leprosy ever being healed before the New Testament. Jesus does something that most likely the people of his day had never seen. He heals leprosy. But he does one other thing here, and I want to make sure you hear this in the scripture. Jesus reached out and touched him. Now understand, leprosy was contracted skin to skin. It was that deadly, it was that contagious. Just touching the leper endangered you of getting leprosy. This man didn't come and say, "Jesus, please touch me." He said, "Jesus, please heal me." This man had likely never experienced human touch in years. From the time he was diagnosed with leprosy until that day, possibly for years, he had never had a single human being touch him. Think about that. Think about going for years without a pat on the back or a handshake or a hug or a kiss, or even just somebody putting their hand on your shoulder and telling you it's going to be okay. And Jesus does, before Jesus heals him, Jesus reaches out and touches him. Now, don't get this wrong. Jesus didn't do the TV healing, be healed and push him back. Jesus came and just tenderly put his hand on him and said, "I am willing. Be healed." And you can imagine it, and I would love to have been there to see what happened. When Jesus touched him and said, "Be healed," you can just imagine that dark, scabby, scaly skin, just pure, clean skin begins to just radiate around his arms. And you can see the crowd just amazed. And what had been a diseased, broken man, that healing just spreads. There's no more smell of disease. His body is just cleansed and healed. And Jesus has his hand on it. The crowd is amazed, and Jesus says, "Now, go to the priest. The Jewish law had a certain offering that had to be taken and given when you were cleansed as a thanksgiving to God. I can tell you, based on Jewish history, when that man showed up at the temple that day, that priest, they had to pick him up off the ground when he fainted. Because they had never seen somebody cleansed from leprosy. And it's a great story, and it's an inspiring story, and it's a wonderful story. And it's a true story. That Jesus comes and touches this man and cleanses him. And you say, Pastor, how does that connect with me? I live a long time past leprosy. I live a long time past when people got leprosy. But I want to tell you this morning, you don't. Now, in our world, in modern day, good healthcare America, we do live beyond leprosy for the most part. But you and I are just as sick as this man was. Before we come to Jesus, we are just like him. But we have a disease that's a little bit different. It's not called leprosy, but it's just as deadly. It's called sin. It's called the sin that lives in our hearts. And I told you, I thought about my days in college before I really gave my life over to Christ and His power to heal me and to lead me and to save me. And the thing about sin is, it's just like leprosy. It's fatal. Sin will kill you every time, and it'll do it slow most times. But there's a disadvantage to sin. At least with leprosy, you know you're sick. You can see there's something wrong. With sin, it just lives on the inside, and you can hide it. And we're really good at hiding sin. We're really good at tucking our sin away and keeping it deep inside our hearts. And people don't see our sin like they might see leprosy. But make no mistake, sin will eat away at your life just like leprosy does too. And if we're honest, even after we come to Jesus, even after we come like this man did and bow at Jesus' feet and we're healed, we're still sinners. Every single day. I was listening to an old tape I had of a Christian singer by the name of Rich Mullins, who's really my favorite Christian singer of all time. And he talked about the need to rededicate your life. If you've been in a Baptist church before, you know what rededicating means. You haven't been living right, you come down front and rededicate your life. And Rich Mullins talked about, he put a good spin on it. He said when he was a teenager, you'd go to youth camp every year. And the last night of youth camp, you'd have a bonfire and you'd come down and rededicate your life because you'd gotten off track with following Jesus. And he said, then you got into college, and in college you had to rededicate your life every time you showed up at church, which was maybe every 6 months when you went home. He said you get into your 20s and you have to rededicate your life every few months. In your 30s, it's maybe every Sunday. If you get in your 40s like me, you find out you have to rededicate your life about every couple of hours. Because the way we live, right? We sin. Listen, we have the sins we commit when we get angry at people, the sins when we lie at work, the sins when we let our anger express itself and we mistreat people and we don't show mercy and grace. And then we have the sins we keep deep inside that nobody knows about. The sins that just eat away at our soul like a cancer. So we may not have leprosy like the man that came to Jesus. We have a much worse disease. We have sin. But the good news in the story is this. Sin may eat away at our hearts and our lives just like leprosy does. But there is a cure for that sin disease. Because just like Jesus put His hand on the leper and cured him, when you come to Jesus, if you have come to Jesus or if you need to come to Jesus, and you say, Jesus, just like that leper, you are helpless and hopeless and out of options. Jesus says, I am willing to cleanse you. I died on the cross. I gave my life to fix you, to heal you, to save you, and I'm going to give you that grace. And that sin disease that is like leprosy of the soul, Jesus comes in and He heals us. That's grace. The grace is when Jesus just breaks into our lives and that sickness that is so deep in us, He heals us. But here's what's so great about grace. It's not just limited to forgiveness. It's not just limited to healing of our souls. Because grace means Jesus doesn't just say, okay, you're forgiven, that's it. Grace takes it a whole step further. Grace is where Jesus doesn't just heal, Jesus touches. Grace is the touch of Jesus on our lives. I want you to think about touch for a minute. Do you realize that touching someone can be this, at one point, the most intimate thing you can do, and it can be the most offensive thing you can do. If somebody doesn't want you to touch them, it's offensive if you touch them, right? You touch somebody the wrong way, you go to jail. You get mad and hit somebody, you go to jail. But if there's somebody you love and you hug them and you rub their shoulder, you give them a kiss on the cheek, that can be the most intimate and reassuring thing. For those of you that are married, think about the first time you kissed your spouse. I mean, when you were young and dating and you still kissed, right? You still better kiss no matter how long you've been married. You remember it, don't you? You remember the first time you held their hand. I remember clearly the first time I kissed my wife. I'm not telling you about it, but I remember the first time I kissed my wife. Because listen, I love my wife, and I kissed her, and that's a cherished memory. Now, what if that day I had stood in front of my wife and I knew we were in love and I wanted to give her that kiss and I'd said, I enjoy being with you. Well, that's nice. It's nice to tell somebody you enjoy being with them, right? Is that the same as a touch? Is that the same as a kiss or a holding hand? Do you see why it's such a big deal that Jesus didn't just say, okay, Mr. Leper, you're healed? The body could have been healed just as much. But Jesus said, not only am I going to fix you, I'm going to love you. Not only am I going to fix your sickness, I'm going to let you know that I love you enough to touch you when you are nasty and sick and dirty. And whether it's physical sickness or in our case, soul sickness, Jesus does the same thing. He says, I don't just want to forgive you by my death on the cross. I want to adopt you as my child. I want you to be part of my family. I want you to come in and be one of us. Jesus could have just said, I forgive you of your sins. But he said on the cross, when he gave his life, when he came out of that tomb that he had borrowed for 3 days, he said to us, not only do I forgive you, but you're part of the family. And I'm making a home for you. You remember what he told his disciples before he died on the cross? He said, I am going to prepare a place for you. You're not just clean, you're in the family. That's grace. That's the touch of Jesus. It's not just a footnote in the Bible that Jesus goes to a leper and before he heals him, he puts his hand on him and shows him the grace of touch and the grace of love. It's a message to you and I that God's grace, no matter how sick we are, no matter how nasty we are, no matter how dirty we are, God's grace touches us and loves us and forgives us. That touch is God's grace. Think of that leper, broken by his sickness, sick from his disease, not even remembering what it felt like for another human being to touch him. And before Jesus heals him, he puts his hand on him. And it says to that leper, I love you just like that. But I'm not going to leave you like that. I'm going to heal you. And see, it's what Jesus does for you and I. When we finally come to the point of giving up on trying to fix ourselves and we come to Jesus, he touches us. He says, I love you just as you are, but I'm not going to leave you that way. Because listen, trying to fix ourselves, it's like the time I broke Holly's coffee mug. Husbands, you've done this. You've been down this road, right? You break the mug and what happens? Hopefully your wife's not home. And you go to Ace Hardware and you get some super glue, and it looks real good after you glue it back together, right? It looks horrible, right? And we somehow think it's going to pass, right? We're going to put it up on the shelf and she's not going to know, right? We put that super glued mug up there and our wife comes home and we got maybe until the next morning when she makes coffee, right? It looks horrible. See, that's our life, right? That's the leprosy of the soul when we try and fix it. However we try and fix it, through working hard enough. See, that's what some of us do. We say, man, I've got to fix myself. I've got to fix my sins. I've got to fix my soul. I'm going to work really, really, really hard. I'm going to go to church a whole bunch and I'm going to give a lot of money and I'm going to serve in every way I can. I'm just going to try and gut it out to get to Jesus. And it's like that super glued mug. And some of us, like in the story of the prodigal son, we say, I'm not fixing anything. I'm just going to put the pieces back up there and go have a good time. And that's just as big a mess as the super glued mug. But Jesus says, you can't fix it, and you don't have to fix it. Because when you are sick with soul leprosy, I'm going to come and I'm going to put my hands on you because I love you. And I love you so much, I'm going to fix you. And I'm going to heal you. And I'm going to cleanse you. And that, church, is grace. It's the grace. Grace is what we don't deserve. It's what we can't earn. It's what we can't buy. Grace is Jesus with a leper on his knees before him, and he touches him, even before he heals him. Grace is what Jesus has done for every one of you that has ever gotten to the end of your rope and you said, Jesus, I got nothing left. Please fix me. And he touches your life and he heals you. And you may be here this morning and you say, I'm either at the end of my rope or I'm like 2 inches from it. And the great thing is you need to hear this story this way. This leper who has no hope comes to Jesus. And Jesus doesn't strike up a contract with him and heal him. Jesus loves him and heals him. That's grace. That leper comes seeking fixing and he gets love. We come to Jesus seeking forgiveness and we get adoption. We are adopted as his children. So how do we live in light of Matthew 8, 1 through 4? If this is all true, and it is, if grace is true, and if you've experienced grace, you know it's true. And if you've not experienced it, it's available from Jesus this morning. But once you experience that grace, how do we live? Well, here's the first question I'd ask you. If Jesus has met you where you were, in your leprosy of the soul, and he's healed you, are you still on your knees begging him to heal you? See, that's what some of us do. Some of us come to Jesus and we ask him to heal us and forgive us, and he does. But then every time we mess up, we come back and we think we've got to do it all over again. Now, don't mishear me. When we sin, we need to ask for forgiveness. But when we sin, we ask Jesus to forgive us, and then we move on because the forgiveness is guaranteed. But see, some of us live in this perpetual cycle where we sin and we come back to Jesus like the leper and we say, Jesus, please heal me again. I'm so bad. I'm so horrible. I can't do anything right. And we live our life on our knees instead of living life in Jesus' grace. Jesus' grace forgives you for every sin you have ever done, every sin you will ever do, every sin you're thinking about right now, every sin you will do when you leave here. Listen. I think the older I get in life, the one thing I realize about temptation is that it comes more and more. I think somehow I hope that when I got to 40, temptation would slack off because I just was tired at the end of every day. Temptation just grows and it comes more and more. Listen, we're all human. We give in to that temptation all the time. We give in to the temptation and the sin takes over us. But listen, what Satan wants you to do is when you sin to think, oh my goodness, I've messed up my entire life again. And I got to go back to square one. And I got to get healed all over again. Because here's what happens. You sin every day. And if we can't live in the forgiveness and grace of Christ, then we will just keep coming back every day. And we'll be no good for him. I don't mean to tell you in any way this morning to take sin lightly. But what I do mean to say to you is this. Don't take sin lightly, but don't take God's grace lightly either. See, we think God's grace is not as powerful as it is. We think that every time we sin, we've got to go back and get everything fixed all over again. We don't understand that when we have accepted Christ, his grace in our lives covers everything. Everything, every single sin. And we do, as I said, when we sin, we need to ask God to forgive us, but we don't need to sit there and say, oh, I wonder if he forgave us. Oh, did I go to church last Sunday because he's not going to forgive me if I didn't go to church? And did I tithe last month because he may not forgive me if I didn't tithe? You say, Jesus, please forgive me, and it's done. It's gone. There was a lady, a story I heard of a lady who, when she was very young, she got an abortion. She got pregnant with her boyfriend and she got an abortion. And many years later, she got married. And she was getting ready to get married, and she went to her pastor for counseling, and she said, Pastor, I'm about to marry this man that I love. And I know that I did this. I got this abortion, and I need to share this with him. I don't want to go in this marriage with this secret. But I feel so guilty. I just know God can't forgive me for this. And the pastor said, ma'am, God's grace, God's blood on the cross forgives you for everything. And if you've accepted Jesus, that sin is covered and it is gone. And so he said, can I pray with you? And he prayed with her, and he shared in this prayer about the grace of Christ and the grace of God and how Jesus cleanses every sin. And the prayer was so moving that when he finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes and she said, you know, I think I can now go and tell my husband to be about the abortion. And the pastor looked her in the face and he said, what abortion? He said, that's what God's grace does. It's gone. It's done. And we can live in that power every day if we will understand how powerful and how awesome grace is. That grace takes the leprosy of our souls and it cleanses us. It makes us fresh and clean and whole. So are you living still on your knees every day begging God to forgive you? Or are you living in light of His grace? So that's for us. That's a question for us. But here's a question for how we live in light of others. Do we give grace to others? Understand, I don't want to wallow in who I was before I came to Jesus, but I do want to have a clear picture of all that Jesus forgave me of. Because see, here's the thing. If Jesus can forgive me, knowing what I've done before I knew Jesus, knowing what I've done after I knew Jesus, if grace is enough for me, I can't hold anything against somebody else. If I understand that God has cleansed and healed me, I have no right to hold anything against anybody else. So here's my question to you. If you have experienced God's grace, when you interact with other people, when you deal with other people, when you see other people, do you see the symptoms of their leprosy, or do you see that they're sick? Let me understand that. Do you see all the bad things they do because they don't know Jesus and say, man, that's a bad person. Good night. Look at all the bad things they do. Or do you say, man, that's somebody that's sick. That's somebody that doesn't have Jesus. Man, they need Jesus. They so need Jesus. See, we want to see their symptoms. We want to see the things that sin makes them do. Not see that they are just as we were. And not have the grace that says, man, I want to go to that person and I want to tell them, man, friend, I was just like you. I had that same leprosy deep in my soul, but God healed me. God changed me. God fixed me up. You can read every book you can find about how to grow a church, about how to be a Christian, about how to live the Christian life. But let me tell you, here's the missing brick in the foundation of being a Christian. It's an understanding of God's grace. As churches, as Christians, we need to understand God's grace. We need to understand that when we came to Jesus, we were not in that crowd looking on saying, man, what a filthy leper. We were the leper. We were sick and dirty and dying. And we came to Christ and He forgave us. His grace just overpowered us. His grace ambushed us. Because if we can understand that grace, we will live that grace to other people. It doesn't mean we will just excuse sin. It doesn't mean we will say, oh, go do whatever you want, live however you want. It means that instead of being the judges of sin, we will go to people and we will say, man, I know what it's like to be where you are. I was there. I lived in that leprosy of the soul. I lived in that soul sickness. I lived in that sin. I know how it is to be you. But one day I met a man who put his hand on me when I was sick. And he healed me. And he saved me. And he forgave me. And he gave me the grace and the power to live every day of my life for Him. Our world doesn't need any more judges. Our world doesn't need any more solutions from the church. Our world doesn't need any more Christian do's and don'ts. Our world needs Christians that can come in here on a Sunday morning and sing these songs of how great God's love is for us, of how much He loved us, that He forgave us, that what the kids sang for us, that if God's grace is an ocean, we're drowning in it. That's how great His grace is compared to our sin. That we can come in and worship and love and be reminded of it and think about that grace. And then when we stand up and we walk out those doors, we carry that grace to the world around us. We carry that grace to people who are executives in offices, whose sin is that they cheat on every tax form they ever turn in. We can carry that grace to the lady that has no choice but to turn to drugs as a way to make the pain stop. We can carry that grace to our neighbor whose greatest sin is they're just a jerk. And they're just mean and nasty to us. We can carry that grace to the sinner who's the guy at work that just loves to talk as foul as you can imagine. Grace is that missing building block of Christianity. It's the missing building block of our lives as Christians, but it's not the missing building block of Jesus. Jesus' grace leads him to touch a leper, to put his hand on a leper and bring healing. When you and I have experienced God's grace radically, powerfully, and we say, I am blown away by what Jesus' grace did in our lives, we will be able to go into a world that desperately is in need of God's grace. And we will be able to share it with other people. When we see people whose sin is like a leprosy of their soul, we'll go to them and say, man, I've been there. I know what it's like to be you. Let me tell you how I was healed and made free and cleansed and adopted by Jesus. The world does not need us telling them all the things they did wrong. The world needs us to tell them how they can be made right with God because we experienced it first. So think on this story as you leave here this morning. Think about the fact that you and I were that man. Let me read it again. A man with leprosy approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, the man said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Jesus reached out and touched him. Period. Before he heals, before he forgives, before he makes right, Jesus reaches out and touches him. I am willing, he said, be healed, and instantly the leprosy disappeared. Don't take your sin lightly. But heaven knows, don't take grace lightly. God's grace, as the old hymn says, is greater than all our sin. The ones we've done in the past, the ones we'll do today, the ones we'll do until the day we die on this earth. But until we can understand his grace, until we can grasp it and be in awe of it, and be, as one writer said, and I like this phrase, until we can become drunk with God's grace and with the power of it, we won't be any good for God. But when we become, and pardon me for saying drunk in a Baptist church on Sunday morning, until we can become drunk, when we become drunk on God's grace, we will change the world. And people who are sick in their souls will be set free. If you'll stand up, we're just going to take a few moments and be quiet. We're just going to bow our heads and just think for a moment. If you need to come and share something, if you just need to come and pray, if you need to come and say, I feel just like that leper today, come and let me pray with you. Come and pray here at the front. Let's bow our heads, and I'm going to pray for us. Lord, I don't know what every person here is dealing with this morning. I thank you that they're here. God, I know who I was before I came to you, and Lord, I know who I am after I came to you. But I know that your grace is powerful enough, and it's deep enough, and it's rich enough that it covers both of those versions of Tom Covington. And God, I pray for the people here. I pray for those I know and those who are guests this morning that I don't know. God, we all are desperately in need of that grace. And if anybody here, if they are like that leper, they are helpless and hopeless and at the end of their rope. God, I pray that you would ambush them with your grace. I pray you do it before they get out the doors. I pray that they couldn't walk out the doors before they get right with you. But God, I pray that we would all begin to have an understanding of the depth and riches of your grace. I pray unashamedly, Lord, that we would become drunk with your grace. That it would just cover us, and that we would drown in the ocean of your grace.